Hi, I'm Reed Murphy. This is a sample lesson that I have taught in the past for a ninth grade general biology class. It's in the evolution unit that, well, what we'll cover in this lesson is really just common ancestor, analogous, and homology structures and things like that. So I always like to start the class with a question of the day or just bell work, get students in the mind of thinking about evolution, things like that. This question here kind of looks at things that we did in the previous unit, looking back at Lamarck and Darwin. Also, students have to answer a question that combines all the model making that are created for our change and trait over time. So it's just pokes at that and tries to get them to explain that whole model that we've created. So I like to start each class after that with a schedule. This was taught back in March, but it just gives them a layout what we're going to do today. So welcome them. We do our bell work together. We get into a web class that we'll do together. And then if time, students can work on an evolution packet and we'll discuss that whole web class as a class. And what I always like to do over here on the right side of the screen is post the objectives for the day and just learning targets that we'll be trying to cover. And so we'll start this lesson with posing questions to students as to, are these the same? Is this butterfly, this bat, and bird, are they the same? What do they have in common? I usually give the students a little time to do a little turn and talk, come up with the general statement idea of what students think. So after students answer that question, I then move the slide further and I say, now let's take a little closer look. What's the same? What's different? And so again, we're poking at the shape of the wings within the butterfly, bat, and bird. Again, we have a little discussion on that. And then I pose another question looking at a human, cat, whale, or bat. Are they the same? What's different? What are some commonalities? Get them again to talk to the neighbor, come up with a general statement. We talk about that. Most students come up with the idea that all these individuals are mammals. So that's usually the common thing that students get. Then I say, what if I have an x-ray machine? And let's take a little x-ray of each animal and human. So here's our human skeleton, cat skeleton, bat skeleton, whale skeleton. Have students again talk to each other at their tables. What's common, what's different, have a little open discussion. Then we take an even closer look at just the arm or fin or wing, whatever you want to call it, of the human, cat, whale, and bat. And so this has the bone structures colored and labeled for the students. Again, talking to their neighbors, looking at what's common, what's different, and students should start to see that the bones are similar in each animal, but they might be shaped differently. That's the idea of where students should be at. And so, again, we just have a little open discussion, describing our observations. What do we know so far? We know that our human, cat, bat, and whale have similar bone structures. We know that our butterfly, bat, and bird have similar wing structures. And then I pose this question as to, we have a new organism, unidentified organism that we discovered. How do we compare this skeleton structure down here to our mammals that we just looked at? And so students will again talk to each other at their tables. What does this organism look like? What do they think it is? What's similar to the mammals that we looked at above? And then once students kind of brainstorm some ideas, we move into what do we know about whales? So students have the opportunity to throw out any background knowledge that they have about whales. And then I pose the question as to, this is a whale. What do you guys think of that? And so students will kind of look at me like puzzled. They won't really know what to think of that. And I say wholeheartedly, that's a whale. And leads into a little discussion. And so I ask, how can we observe this whale? How do we know it's a whale? It lived 50 million years ago. How do we observe this species, this organism right here? And from past notes and lessons that we've done before, students should be able to recognize that we can use the fossil record, anatomy, biochemistry, looking at DNA, and the biogeography, use that type of science to learn more about this organism. And so this is when we dive into the web quest. Students will look at the anatomy, the fossils, embryos, and DNA that closely related to the species that whales fall under. So students will need their computers. I will send out the link in an email. They'll finish the packet. If they finish early, they can continue working on an evolution packet that we've been working on throughout this evolution unit. And so this web quest comes from the University of Utah. Their Learn Genetics. They have fun, interactive educational labs. This one's not super interactive. It's more of a guide walking through time from the beginning of our whale to what we see nowadays. And so here's just a little example of what it is. Fish or mammal. You learn more about backgrounds of whales so students can learn about what a whale is. We look at comparative anatomy between animals and fish and whales. We look at the fossil record, so this species over time. And then we look at still comparative anatomy, looking at bone structure. We look at embryos, so the development of embryos over time. And then we look at the DNA sequence of different species and how closely related they are. So students will have a little packet, they'll walk through it. After they're finished, we'll come back to class, discuss some main questions that could have come about throughout that whole investigation, talk about it, and then we'll continue to dive into our notes, and then hopefully students realize that this occurring phenomenon that we see of why we have mammals have similar bone structures is living things come from a common ancestor. So we define common ancestor. I don't expect students to understand how to read a phylogenetic tree. I just kind of tell them that anything down here, this would be the common ancestor to every living thing, or bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotic species. So once we just branch off, we have a branching point here, closely related to the next thing on the chain, and farther, like more unrelated as you move up. So we define common ancestor, we walk through it. I give an example of a cladogram, just explaining again how species are related. So if we look down here, every species up here, from shark to bird, have a vertebrae. Then you can get more defined as we go up along the cladogram. So looking at eggs with shells. So this would be the closest relative to our crocodile and bird species. I give students a little question as to what's the common ancestor between whales and humans? Can you find that number point on the cladogram? So hopefully students can realize that this common ancestor down here that split off into the whale and human would be the common ancestor. So then here I ask the students, is this a whale? And students will say yes, I'll say give me reasons why. And so hopefully they learn from the lab, they can look at the fossil record, embryo, or DNA structures to observe this. I showed them a visual of this change from a quote unquote whale that was once terrestrial is now aquatic. So just a visual for some students. And then we try to elaborate more on the common ancestors of our butterflies, bats, and birds. And what we realize is that they're analogous structures. So they have similar function and the structures in organisms. So all of our bats, birds, and moths or butterflies, they fly, but they're from different origins. So they're not close related, but they have similar processes, which would be flight. And so we define comparative anatomy, so looking at bone structures that they did within the um, web quest, looking at different bone structures of different mammals and how they're similar in shape and location, but have a different form, really. So a femur here on the human versus a femur here on what I think is an ostrich. So much different in size, but same um, function and form. So both within the leg. Then we define homology. So similarity due to having a shared common ancestor. So what students should realize that all these were mammals, so they come from a similar common ancestor that was once a mammal, and then they split off into their own little niche, and that's why we have different structures for a different purpose. So again, this slide just lays out for students looking at the difference between homologous structures versus homologous structures. Again, these are more similarly or closely related compared to the analogous structures. They just have a similar function versus homologous structures that are similar due to a common ancestor. And so, trying to explain more of what we've learned through the web quest and discovered, we look at the common ancestors and looking at where did the legs go of our whale. So we know up here we have our four-legged terrestrial whale, our Pakicetus, that over time evolved into our whale that has their front fins but don't have their um, hind legs anymore. So what happened to them? And so we call this vestigial organs. So organs of the body in which are smaller or simpler than those related to other species. So they have lost their use for them. They don't need them anymore. So they don't really serve a purpose. They kind of go away over time after generations and many generations, which is why we don't see whales with their hind legs anymore. And humans have examples of vestigial organs. We have our appendix, for example. We have the hairs in our arm. The hairs on our arm don't serve a purpose. It used to be we had more hair that kept us warm, and now it doesn't really serve a purpose because we have nice warm coats. But that really concludes the lesson. I always end with a exit ticket for students to answer, things that cover the objectives for the day. So checking for understanding if our students met those learning objectives. So our first question looks at common ancestors, looking at who's more closely related, and then a kind of more critical thinking question as to does a flying squirrel have excuse me, analogous wings to birds or bats? It's kind of a more critical thinking question because flying squirrels technically don't have wings. It's a fold of skin. But just see where students are in their thinking and um, seeing if they understood all of the learning objectives for the day. And that concludes the sample lesson. Thanks.